In this course, we start off by talking about ethical theory. So first we're going to be talking about metaethics. If that term is unfamiliar to you, go back and watch the What is Philosophy video. Metaethics deals with this question about whether or not there is such a thing as objective moral truth. So we're starting there. We're going to be moving then into normative ethics, which talks about what we ought to be doing, how we ought to live our lives. And then we're going to be getting into bioethics specifically, where we take all those lessons and try to put them to work specifically in the context of the life sciences. So if you look at the schedule for the course, we begin by talking about patient-physician relationships. What does it mean to have a good moral relationship with one's patients? How should medical research be conducted? Should we inform test subjects of what's going on? Should we keep information from them? How should we handle medical records? Should all of those remain confidential? Is it okay to share that information with family and next of kin? All questions about what's right and what's wrong in these contexts, specifically with respect to the patient-physician relationship. After that, we move into issues of life and death. So we look at questions about whether or not abortion is morally permissible. We look at questions about whether or not gene editing or genetic selection are things we ought to be doing. And that section concludes with a discussion of whether or not medical aid in dying is a morally permissible thing to be engaged in. So is it okay for physicians to actually help patients end their life when the patients want that? The course then concludes by talking about more justice-related issues. So questions about how do we handle distribution of scarce resources like ventilators when we have too many people who need a ventilator and not enough ventilators to go around, or organs for transplant. We have 13 people need a heart transplant, but only 7 hearts to give. How do we make decisions about who gets a particular resource and who doesn't? And then the course ends by talking about distribution of healthcare generally. Is it the case that there is a right to healthcare? Should everyone be given healthcare for free? Or is healthcare something that we can expect people to pay for that we don't have to just give out as a society? So that gives you a little picture of where this is all going. But back to the starting line. We have to ask the question of whether or not there's even such a thing as moral truth. Because if there's not such a thing as moral truth, if it's just whatever people want it to be, you have your truth, I have my truth, then all of our conversations are going to kind of go nowhere. We're dealing with ethical questions at every step of the way. When talking about the patient-physician relationship, we're asking what's a morally good relationship between the patient and the physician. When talking about issues of life and death, we're talking about which sorts of actions, which sorts of policies are morally permissible and which ones are not. Now, if there's no moral truth, then the answer to all of those questions is there's no answer. When you want to know whether abortion is permissible or not, there's just no answer because there's no such thing as morality. So whether or not there's moral truth is going to have a profound impact on this entire class. Now, one of the most popular viewpoints that there is no such thing as objective moral truth is called cultural relativism. This was in today's reading by James Rachels, and Rachels defines cultural relativism like this. Cultural relativism says there's no such thing as universal truth in ethics. There are only various cultural codes and nothing more. Or, put a little bit differently, customs cannot be said to be correct or incorrect, for that implies we have an independent standard of right and wrong, but there is no such standard. In other words, Rachels is saying, for the cultural relativist, there's no real right and wrong. It's just one society has their set of rules that they think are morally good and morally okay. Another society has a different set of rules, and no societies are right or wrong. You can't measure the rightness or wrongness of different societies because that would imply you have some standard by which to measure them. So for example, in society A, let's say that lying is morally okay. In society B, different society, different group of people, lying is bad, lying is wrong. And then we ask the question, which society is right? Cultural relativism will say, neither. There's no way to compare. Whereas a non-relativist will say there is some particular standard and some societies are closer to the truth than others. So there is such a thing as moral truth, and some societies embody moral truth more effectively or to a greater degree than other societies. And so we can put these societies in a kind of a ranking system where some are closer to the truth than others. But again, the relativist is going to say you can't do that. One society has their own rules, different society has different rules, and that's the end of the story. Now, cultural relativism is a very popular view. So just at this university alone, when I've taught this course in the past, I've asked the following question. I've said, okay, tell me whether you think this is true or false. And the statement is, moral issues are either entirely relative or relative for the most part. In the past at this university, 81, 82% of students say true. So 81 or 82% of students agree that moral issues are either entirely relative or just relative for the most part. And this sample is by no means a good one, right? It's not a very large sample size, for example. It's not testing lots of different demographics. It's just at this particular university, in the past courses I've taught, students have tended to agree that moral issues are relative. So the question just is why? Why think that cultural relativism or moral relativism are true? Why think that there's no objective moral truth in the universe? And based on the readings for today, there's really two major arguments that you might look at here. The first I'll call the differences argument, and the second is the tolerance argument. So two types of arguments that are commonly given in support of cultural relativism. We'll start then with the differences argument. So this is in the reading. It goes something like this. Premise 1, different cultures have different moral codes. So you look around the world, you see lots of different countries, lots of different social groups have different sets of what they think is right and wrong. They have different practices, different beliefs. That seems like an empirically true statement. A lot of variation between cultures and their moral codes. The second premise then tells us that if different cultures have different moral codes, then there's no objective truth in morality. So because there's so much variation in what people think is right and wrong, there just couldn't possibly be any sort of universal objective moral truth. And if you accept those two claims, you accept premise 1, you accept premise 2, then the conclusion just follows that there is no objective truth in morality. Or put differently, if you think the conclusion is false, if you think there really is such a thing as an objective morality, then you have to either throw out the first statement or throw out the second statement. The problem, though, is that the differences argument looks a little bit suspicious. We said that the first statement, that different cultures have different moral codes, that one's hard to argue with, right? You can go around the world and check and see different cultures really do have different moral codes. But that second premise is a little bit weird. So why think that just because there are differences, there's no fact of the matter, there's no truth? To really drive this point home, suppose we give a different argument that follows the exact same logical structure. So it begins very similarly. First premise, different people have different beliefs about Earth's shape. So some people believe that the Earth is round, some people believe that the Earth is flat. There's differences between people's beliefs about the Earth's shape. That's empirically true. Second premise then, if different people have different beliefs about Earth's shape, then there's no objective truth in the matter. And from this, it just follows that there's no objective truth regarding Earth's shape. So we said, yes, it's true that there are differences in belief about Earth's shape. Second premise tells us that if there are all these differences, people have all these different beliefs about what Earth looks like, then there just must be no truth in the matter, and so it follows that there's no truth regarding Earth's shape. So I like to ask students, is this a good argument? Is this convincing? Have you been convinced that there's no truth regarding the shape of the Earth? And they always respond, no, this is a silly argument, right? Part of that is because just because different people have different beliefs, that doesn't imply that nobody's right. In other words, just because disagreement exists, that doesn't imply there's no fact of the matter. I may think that the Earth is round. George may think that the Earth is flat. Steve may think that the Earth is pyramid-shaped. But just because we disagree, that doesn't mean nobody's right. the Earth is shaped like a sphere, regardless of what these people believe. So going back to the differences argument regarding moral truth, why on earth would we think that just because cultures have different beliefs about what's right and what's wrong, that that's good enough reason to conclude that there's no such thing as moral truth? In other words, people disagree about stuff all the time, but that doesn't imply there's no truth. So the differences argument isn't giving us a good reason to believe that there's no such thing as objective moral truth. We need some other reason to believe that. So we're still looking for an argument that moral relativism or cultural relativism is correct. Right? We still need an argument to show that there's no such thing as objective moral truth. Setting the differences argument aside, there's the tolerance argument. And that goes like this. If you believe that your moral position is correct and others' moral position is incorrect, then you're closed-minded and intolerant. But you should not be closed-minded and intolerant, so you shouldn't believe that your moral position is correct and other people's moral position is incorrect. This idea, I think, has a lot of traction with people today. The idea is, look, I don't want to be a jerk and say that other people's way of life is wrong, right? That's intolerant. And so I'm just going to say I have my truth, they have their truth, and we're just going to kind of stay separate. So I want to be a tolerant person. I want to respect the differences between people. And so I say, okay, there's no such thing as moral truth. But think about the first premise here. If you believe your moral position, your moral perspective is correct and other people's is incorrect, that makes you intolerant. Well, cultural relativism is a moral perspective. It's a moral position. And so if cultural relativists are saying cultural relativism is true, then that tells every non-relativist they're wrong. And that's intolerant. So premise one is just saying, if you're a cultural relativist and you say cultural relativism is true, non-relativism is false, you're being intolerant of people who are not relativists. What this means then is if you accept this first statement, you can't be a tolerant person and a cultural relativist. If you're a cultural relativist and you're saying cultural relativism is the truth, then you're being intolerant towards anyone who disagrees with you. So you have to either be a cultural relativist or a tolerant person, but you can't be both. But even if we set that problem aside, let's look at the second premise here. It tells us that you should not be closed-minded or intolerant. So it's bad to be closed-minded. It's bad to be intolerant. Well, that's a moral claim. Is it morally bad to be intolerant? And if so, that looks like a moral truth, right? So if you accept premise 2, you're saying it's true that intolerance is morally bad. And if you're saying that, then relativism is false because you're committed to this idea that intolerance is bad. That's a moral truth. If intolerance really is bad, if it's really bad to be intolerant of other people's worldview or other people's moral practices, then relativism is false because you're just saying it is a moral truth that intolerance is bad. If you're a cultural relativist, not only are you intolerant, but you're not in a position to say intolerance is bad. You might not like it. You might say I don't like intolerance, but you can't say intolerance is objectively bad and still be a relativist. As soon as you say something like intolerance is objectively bad, that's committing you to being a non-relativist. You're saying there is this moral truth, and here's one such moral truth. Intolerance is bad. That's a moral truth. You say, okay, that's fine. You can believe that, but then you're not a relativist. So if you think tolerance is a good thing, if you think tolerating other ways of life is a good thing, you're not a relativist. Alternatively, if you're a relativist, you can't go around telling people that tolerance is good because that commits you to the belief that there's such a thing as moral truth. If a cultural relativist tells you tolerance is good, they're just telling you that they like it, as though they're telling you what their favorite ice cream flavor is, right? They're just saying, I like tolerance. Okay, great. But you're not giving me a reason to be tolerant. You're not saying it's a good thing. So what we've done so far is we've looked at the differences argument, we've looked at the tolerance argument. I think these are two of the most popular arguments for believing there's no such thing as an objective moral truth. Neither argument seems very convincing when you start looking at it up close. So the differences argument is too weak because simply that two people disagree about something, it doesn't mean that there's no truth. And then the tolerance argument says tolerance is good. You ought to be tolerant. Those are moral claims, and if they're objectively true, then relativism is false. If they're not objectively true, then you're just saying that you like tolerance, and that's not giving me a reason to be tolerant. So if the claim tolerance is good is true, then relativism is false. And if relativism is true, you can't go around saying that tolerance is a good thing. All you can say is that you like it. We still don't have an argument for moral relativism. We still don't have a good argument for believing that there's no objective moral truth. Let's set all of that aside, though. Let's just suppose for a minute that there really is no such thing as objective moral truth, and we'll look at what follows. So if there's really no such thing as an objective moral truth, here are just a few consequences of that view. First off, no societies are better or worse than any other. So a society that permits slavery, that permits genocide, that permits killing of any kind, that's not a bad society. It's not worse than any others. They're just different. So anytime you're looking at a different society, one that practices genocide, one that doesn't, you can't say one is better or worse. They're just different. And that's the end of the story. On the other hand, if your intuition here, if your reaction to that is to say, no, practicing genocide is wrong, no matter who you are, no matter what your societal practices are, then okay, you're not a relativist. So a relativist is going to have to say societies that practice genocide and societies that don't, they're just different ways of life, like different colors of car, right? There's no better or worse here. It's just lots of differences. And that's something that a lot of people will find implausible, this idea that there's really no societies that are better or worse than any others. Kind of related to this is if relativism is true and no one society is better than any others, this holds across time as well. So there's no such thing as moral progress if relativism is true. You can't say that society is better today because there's no slavery than it was in the past when there was slavery, because there's no standard by which you can compare the past society and the present one. All you can say from a relativist standpoint is these are different. So the US allowed slavery in the past, it doesn't allow slavery now. That's a difference. It's not a good change, it's not a bad change, it's just a change. There's no good or bad. Whatever happened in the past, that was their culture, their society, they had their own rules. We have our own rules today, and we're not any better off than they were. On the other hand, if you think that abolishing slavery was a good thing, if you think that things like women's rights, civil rights, all that are good changes in our society, this was actually changing society for the better, then you're not a relativist. Because if you're a relativist, what that means is to say today's society is better than the past, all that means is you like today's society better than the past. But that doesn't give anyone any reason to agree with you. So you're just saying, okay, I like a society without slavery as opposed to a society with slavery. Okay, fine. But that doesn't mean it's true, that it's actually better. So if you're a relativist, you can't say that moral progress is occurring. All you can say is you like the present day practices better than the past ones. That's the end of the story. So if you think, no, there really is such a thing as moral progress, there are some things that have gotten better, there may be even some things that have gotten worse, but there's progress and there's regress, then you're not a relativist. Progress means there's a standard, there's a moral truth, and we're getting better and better and better and better. Or regress means there's a standard of moral truth and we're getting worse and worse and worse and worse. But either way, there is a standard, there is a moral truth. So you can't be a relativist and believe in moral progress. You can't be a relativist and believe in moral regress. If you think moral progress or moral regress occur, you're not a relativist. So just to recap real quick, we've got this idea of cultural relativism, this idea that There's no such thing as objective moral truth. You just have different cultures, different societies. They have their own moral code, their own rights and wrongs. Moral relativism says there's no truth in the matter. It's just one society has their moral code, a different society has a different set of moral codes, but nobody's right or wrong. We looked at two arguments in support of cultural relativism, the differences argument and the tolerance argument. The differences argument failed, the tolerance argument failed. And then we looked at some implications of relativism as well. If you are a relativist, you can't believe that some societies are better or worse than others. You can't believe that there's such a thing as moral progress or that there's such a thing as moral regress. In any case, I'm happy to continue discussing these issues. This just gives you a really basic look into some of the problems that relativism might face. It's not to say that relativists can't overcome these problems. Maybe they can, maybe they can't. But it's something to take into account. If you're going to assert that relativism is true, it's important to know what the costs of that view might be. So we'll continue that conversation on the discussion board. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, if you're outraged, if you think I'm being totally unfair. All of that's fine. I'll discuss that with you on the discussion board.